One of the biggest mistakes people make when it comes to training is that they simply do not train hard enough. I'm going to walk you through in this video how to train at a relative intensity that is going to help you get results when it comes to adding muscle mass or retaining muscle mass. How hard you train, training intensity is key, and a lot of people just don't train hard enough. Okay, now we're going to keep this simple, so after this video you can go into the gym and you can get an idea of how hard you're training and take it to a place where you're training hard enough. One thing I will say is learning to train at an intensity that we're going to talk through right now can take time to develop and get used to. Okay, so it can take weeks, can take months to get to the point where you feel like you are actually training hard enough. So if you don't get it initially, don't stress it. Don't feel like you need to rush into it and jump the gun, because at the end of the day, while we're also trying to train at a relatively high intensity, we also want to be doing it in a way that is obviously safe, controlled. We don't want to run the risk of getting an injury or anything like that. So when we're trying to increase the intensity, we also do want to be careful at the same time. So if it takes a couple of weeks, takes a couple of months for you to get there, don't stress it. It's a long process anyway. Take your time. Okay, so we're going to use a scale to determine how hard we're training. Okay, and this scale is called the rate of perceived exertion, so the RPE scale. Now, it's a relatively simple scale. It is a subjective one, which means, again, if you're relatively new, you might think you're training hard, but you might not actually be training as hard as you potentially can. But this is why I said it can take weeks, months for you to develop a good idea of where you're actually at. So it is a subjective one, which, yes, potentially isn't the best, but it's also hard to create a objective scale when we're looking at intensity, because it is going to come down to you as an individual and how hard you think you're training at that time. This scale is a 1 to 10 scale, okay? So it's basically a scale of how hard you think you're training. 1 being completely fresh, not done anything. 10 being you could not do anything else. You are absolutely flat out. You've had enough. In a similar fashion, but a slightly different approach in how we think about this scale, we could also think about it in terms of reps in reserve. Okay, so if you were training again at a 10 out of 10 intensity, that means you'd have no reps left in the tank at the end of that set. Okay, so you finish the set, you couldn't do a single other rep. You can't shift that weight. That would be 10 out of 10. If you were training at 9 out of 10, you'd have 1 rep in reserve. So at the end of that set, you feel like you could do 1 more rep. If you were training at 8 out of 10, you'd have 2 reps in reserve. At the end of that set, you feel like to yourself, I probably could have done 2 more, but at the end of those 2, I would have been completely done. And so forth. 7 out of 10 being 3 reps in reserve, 6 out of 10 being 4 reps in reserve. Now, the reason why this is a decent way of thinking about it is because when it comes to the intensity and how hard we're training, we want to, for the majority of our session, be training very close to failure, and on some movements, at some points in our training, potentially to failure. Which means we want to be training, let's say, anywhere from 7, 8 out of 10 for the majority of our training, to the point where we feel like we've only got 2, maybe 3 reps left in the tank at the end of each set. Even sometimes taking that to 9, where we feel like we've got 1 rep left in the tank, or even 10, where we feel like we've got no reps left in the tank and we are training to failure. If you're keeping the majority of your training around that 7, maybe 8 out of 10 mark, where you've got 2, 3 reps left in the tank, you are going to be training at a good intensity where we're looking at either adding muscle mass or retaining muscle mass, depending on our goal. There will be times, and maybe dependent on the exercise or dependent on where you are in your training at that particular time, where you then might want to take some of your training, let's say 20%, 10 to 20% of it to failure. Okay, so let's say 80% is at that 7, 8 out of 10, 10, 20% is at that 9, 10 out of 10. If you're keeping numbers within that sort of ballpark, that sort of area, you're going to be doing a good job of training hard enough. You could even break this down into particular exercises. For example, exercises that are, let's say, safer to perform, that aren't going to give us as much risk of maybe injury or the exercise breaking down as easy. For example, if you've got isolation movements where you can easily lock yourself in, say stuff like bicep curls, or if we're doing push downs, leg extensions, leg curls, stuff like that, stuff where you can lock yourself in. It's a very stable environment. Movements like that you could potentially take to that 9, 10 out of 10. Whereas movements where you haven't got as much stability, you've got to create that stability yourself. Bigger movements such as RDLs, squats, bent over rows, bench presses, dumbbell chest presses. Maybe potentially, especially if you're a relative beginner or intermediate, movements like that, you might want to keep more towards the 7, 8 out of 10. If you're doing that and you're training at that level of intensity consistently, you're going to be training hard enough and doing a good job of adding muscle mass / retaining muscle mass. Last thing I want to mention here, like I said, it can take weeks, it could take months to develop this level of intensity. We have to be patient, we have to be smart. On a similar note to that, when you are training 2, 3, 2 reps left in the tank, 1 rep left in the tank, failure, we have to make sure that we're getting to that point while still keeping form and execution strict. So it's when you don't feel like you could do an extra 2, 1, or any more reps while keeping form and execution strict. Not having to sacrifice the form and execution just to shift the weight. If we get to that point where form and execution goes out the window because we're just thinking, I need to get an extra rep no matter what, then we run the risk of injury and whatnot. So it is training at a relative intensity in comparison to form and execution, keeping that as strict as we possibly can until that is going to break down. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, please drop a like. If you haven't already, do go ahead and subscribe. If you've got any comments on this, throw them down below. I can get back to you. I'll catch you on the next one. Take care.